Want to welcome you back to our next video lesson called Little Gems as we continue to make our way through passages of Scripture. Before we begin our time together, I just want to remind you to subscribe to this YouTube channel. Make sure that you turn on notifications, and that way, whenever a new video gets posted, you'll be notified and you'll be able to tune in and watch it. As we continue today to make our way through Hosea, we are continuing to look at these judgments that were announced by God to the people of Israel. And we pick up today in verse 9 and we'll read down to verse 11. Hosea chapter 13, beginning in verse 9, we read, "He destroys you, O Israel, for you are against me, against your helper. Where now is your king to save you in all your cities? Where are all your rulers, those of whom you said, 'Give me a king and princes'? I gave you a king in my anger, and I took him away in my wrath." As we begin looking at this text, I want you to notice that verse 9 comes with a lot of difficulties. If you have multiple English translations, you will be able to look and see that there are a lot of different ways that the various Bibles translate this. The NET Bible translates verse 9 as, "I will destroy you, O Israel." And then it asks a question: who is there to help you? If you have the CSB Bible, it's two statements. "I will destroy you, Israel," God speaking in the first person. And then it says, "You have no help but me." And then if you have the King James Version, you can read even something different. It says, "O Israel, thou hast destroyed thyself, but in me is thine help." So it's almost like a promise there. And then, of course, we have in the ESV, again, "He," that is, God, "destroys you, O Israel." And then he gives the reason, "For you are against me, against your helper." The reason why you have so many different translations is because there is some difficulty with the original language and what exactly is going on there. There are ancient translations like the Old Greek Septuagint that has a different translation and seems to indicate that the very first word is not a verb but is a noun. So Israel's destruction. So a lot of different challenges in understanding exactly what is going on here. I'm going to explain what I think is going on. This is also something that in Dwayne Garrett's commentary on Hosea he proposes, and I think it is right. This word here that we looked at first, "he destroys you," is indeed a verb in the original language. But who is speaking or what is being referred to here could be a pronoun, "he," and the third person, or it could be the word "it." It destroys you. And if it's the case that the word is "it destroys you," the question, of course, is what would that "it" be referring to? And I want to just go back to verse 8 for a moment and just give you a reminder of what we saw there. In verse 8, we read, "I will fall upon them like a bear robbed of her cubs. I will tear open their breast, and there I will devour them like a lion." Notice here these similes: like a bear, and I will tear open their breast, and I will devour them like a lion. And then here, as a wild beast would rip them open. God, of course, here is describing his judgment to come, his wrath against the people of Israel, in, of course, violent imagery of an animal, a wild beast, destroying its prey. But notice that on this last line here, this little word as is actually not in the original text. This is an interpretation by the translators, which is comparing this last line to the other ones that came before, and it's assuming that another simile is being made, right? Wild beast would rip them open, and this is as a wild beast. Well, in the original, you would basically just read a wild beast will rip them open. Okay? Now, when we come back to our text, if you read verse 9 in light of the end of verse 8, it says, a wild beast will rip them open. And then we would read in verse 9, let me get my pen here. It destroys you, O Israel. So the it would be referring to the wild beast, which itself is referring to God's wrath. God's wrath is what is going to come against Israel and destroy them. Then when we come to the next line, here an explanation appears to be given. For you are against me, against your helper. But again, this word here, against and against, can also be taken as an instrument, the means by which something is going to take place. So you could read this line here also as, for it, that is God's wrath, is by me, by your helper. Right, so this wild beast-like destruction that is going to come against Israel is going to completely destroy them because the answer is because it's from God. It's by me and by your helper. In other words, the very one and the only one who could be Israel's help is now going to be the one who has turned against them and who is executing his wrath against them because of their sin. The only one who could save them from any of the other nations that they were so concerned about was the one who was bringing the nations against them again because of their sin. Then when we come to verse 10, we arrive at a taunt. God again says to the people of Israel, where now is your king to save you in all of your cities? Where are all of your rulers? And then notice here, he says, those of whom you said, give me a king and princes. This is a reminder of what the people of Israel demanded a long time ago to have. If you remember, we'll look at this passage here in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 4 to 9. If you remember in 1 Samuel chapter 8, Samuel had some sons who were responsible for judging the people of Israel, essentially ruling over them, but they were wicked and corrupt sons. And so the people of Israel began to cry out against them, and they began to demand that God would give them a king, that Samuel would appoint a king for them. But notice how they requested. Beginning in verse 4 of 1 Samuel, we read, then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now, appoint for us a king. Give us a king, Samuel, to judge us like all the nations. That's who we want to be like, Samuel. We want to be like all of the other nations. Give us a king. And then in verse 6, but the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them, according to all the deeds that they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice, only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall rule over them. This is a tragic episode in the history of Israel because, again, as God was saying, as Israel was demanding a king, they were not rejecting Samuel. They were ultimately rejecting God, and they were demanding that they receive a king who would be to them just like all of the other kings of the nations. That's who they ultimately wanted to be like. They wanted a king who had a strong and powerful presence. And ultimately, they would receive a king just like that in the person of Saul. But he would also be a king who his heart would turn away from the Lord, and he would show himself to be a coward in the face of other nations. And so this is what is being alluded to here in Hosea chapter 13, verses 9 to 11. God is now taunting Israel and asking, where is your king? Where is this king who would save you in all of your cities? Where are all of your rulers, those of whom you said, you said, people of Israel, give me a king and princes, hoping that this king would be the one who could deliver you from all of your enemies. Their king is absent because all of their kings throughout their history have been, by and large, corrupt, and who they have failed in their responsibility ultimately to be obedient to the Lord. And then when we come to verse 11, we read, I gave you a king in my anger. And here, the text actually communicates this idea of something repeatedly happening. So let me correct this here. So here, repeatedly, God repeatedly gave them a king in his anger, and he repeatedly took them away in his wrath. Here, this is a reference to not only what happened in the appointment of Saul as king, but the whole history of the people of Israel. They would demand a king. God would give them a king. That king would be corrupt, and then he would remove that king. You can think back to even as we looked at the references to Jeroboam in last week's sessions. The northern kingdom splits from the southern kingdom. Jeroboam is appointed to be their king, yet Jeroboam is wicked and corrupt, and so God removes him as king. And that was the constant history of the people of Israel. I want you to also notice as well that this is an indication, this is a lesson about God's sovereignty over all of the events that were happening in the life and in the history of the people of Israel. They were responsible for their decisions. They were responsible for the corrupt actions that they were taking in violently deposing kings that they did not like and then appointing their own kings. And yet, sovereign over all of these events was the hand of God. And it's a reminder, friends, that even as we watch events unfold in our own day, And even as we see corrupt rulers rising to power and then being deposed, and nations rising and falling, and people being responsible for all of their own corrupt decisions that they have, it is ultimately the sovereign hand of God who is carrying out his purposes on the earth. So again, a reminder to ultimately be a people who are trusting in the Lord and in all of his ways, and to not look ultimately to the powers that be, to the kings and governmental authorities for our ultimate hope, because one who is the ultimate king stands over all of them, Jesus Christ, the great king, and it is to him to whom we are to look.